All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about personality disorders. So let's just start with the definition. Personality disorders are a group of maladaptive patterns of behavior, cognition, and inner culture that make maintaining relationships and functioning very difficult. So what the heck does that mean? Basically, the behaviors and the thought processes that make up our personality, make us who we are, become distorted. So we can't interact with others in a way that's actually functional and manageable. So there's 3 clusters of personality disorders. Cluster A is odd and eccentric. So that includes schizoid, schizotypical, and paranoid. Cluster B is over-emotional and erratic. So histrionic, narcissistic, antisocial, and borderline. And cluster C is anxious and fearful. So we see obsessive compulsive, avoidant, and dependent personality disorders. Now, for the purposes of this lesson, we aren't going to go into too much detail about the specific ones, but we will talk about the general characteristics of all personality disorders. Now, if you check out the care plan attached to this lesson, it defines a few of these in more specifics. So the first thing to know about personality disorders is that it involves a distortion of reality. Now, remember that patients with schizophrenia, for example, tend to have breaks in reality. Okay, they'll go in and out based on their hallucinations and delusions and what specific type of schizophrenia they have. Patients with personality disorder don't break from reality. They just kind of distort it, and they may, make things seem a way that they actually aren't, but they don't actually fully break from it. Now, the biggest issue that we have with personality disorders is they cannot see or predict the consequences of their actions, and they cannot see their impact of their actions on others. So in a normal situation, let's say this is me and this is you. I recognize that anything I do, especially if you're somebody who is close to me, anything I do can possibly have an impact on you, and I recognize that. Now, let's say this is someone with personality disorder, and this is one of their loved ones, someone close to them. Clients with personality disorder tend to believe that everything they do only ever affects them, okay? They cannot see how their actions affect someone else, and so there's this disconnect, and sometimes it's very difficult and sometimes even impossible for them to take this huge, long route to recognize that the thing that they did or the thing they're thinking of doing might possibly affect someone else. So this is especially true in narcissistic personality disorder because everything is about them, and they can't possibly understand why you would be upset about something they did because in their minds, it just doesn't affect you. So some other defining characteristics, patients with personality disorder tend to have a preoccupation with sex, religion, or themselves, and a distorted view of themselves, whether it's excessively high or excessively low. And all of this just makes it very difficult to maintain relationships. And many of these clients may become expert manipulators to get their way. They also tend to be very excitable, so they'll have excessive response to light or sound, be unable to focus, and possibly even have poor impulse control. And then we also see that many clients with personality disorders tend to deal with their emotions using a physical response, like becoming agitated or violent. All of this has to do with this distortion of their normal behaviors and their normal interactions with other people. So that being said, safety is always our number one priority. We assess for self-harm. We may possibly create a written contract with them stating that they won't harm themselves or anyone else while they're in our care. We also want to promote independence whenever possible, but we still need to be consistent with our limits and boundaries. We also need to make sure that we communicate our expectations as well as managing their expectations. So they need to know what we expect them to do, and they also need to know what we will and won't be doing for them. Now, you should be genuine in all of your interactions with them, and we need to acknowledge splitting if it occurs. So splitting is when the client will try to turn one staff member against the other or split them, or will characterize, some as better or worse. So, these are the good nurses and these are the bad nurses. and it splits the staff. So they may say, well, Susie was my nurse yesterday and she said I could go outside, or even just like, I like Joe better than you. And so we need to acknowledge that when it happens by saying something like, I'm hearing that you're frustrated. Let's talk about that instead of trying to compare staff members. So we want them to discuss, how they're feeling and the emotions that they're having, not the behaviors or the manipulations. So priority nursing concepts for a patient with personality disorder is safety, of course, mood affect, and interpersonal relationships. Again, you can imagine that someone who's manipulative and doesn't see the consequences of their actions would have a lot of difficulty maintaining healthy relationships. So let's recap. Remember that there are 3 clusters of personality disorders, A, B, and C, depending on those key characteristics. Clients with personality disorders tend to have distorted views of reality, and they cannot see the consequences of their behaviors. And it's very common for these clients to use manipulation as a coping mechanism. So we want to acknowledge splitting when it occurs and encourage them to discuss their feelings, not to use physical expression. And then remember that consistency is key. So set those boundaries, set those limits, communicate those expectations, and hold to them. Now, this is so important. A lot of times splitting happens because some people hold to boundaries and some people don't. So it's very important as a staff that you do that as well. And then, of course, safety is always first. Okay, so that's it for personality disorders. Make sure you check out all of the resources attached to this lesson, including the care plan and the patient story. Now go out and be your best self today. And as always, happy nursing.